Marcus Thompson had always been the strongest guy in his unit. At 24, he stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to stretch the fabric of his military uniform. His fellow soldiers often joked that he could carry twice his weight and still outrun half the platoon. But strength, Marcus would learn, isn't always about the muscles you can see. The morning of the accident started like any other training day at Fort Braxton. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Marcus laced up his combat boots, the leather worn smooth from countless drills and exercises. He had been in the Army for 3 years now, and every day brought him closer to his dream of joining the Special Forces. The obstacle courses, the weapons training, the survival exercises. Marcus excelled at them all. "Thompson, you're on equipment maintenance today," Sergeant Rodriguez called out during the morning briefing. Marcus nodded, though he would have preferred the combat simulation scheduled for later that afternoon. Equipment maintenance meant working with the heavy machinery that kept their training facility running smoothly. The warehouse where they stored the training equipment was a massive concrete building filled with everything from vehicle parts to construction materials. Marcus was assigned to help move a damaged armored vehicle component that weighed nearly 800 pounds. The plan was simple: use the overhead crane to lift it, then guide it onto a transport truck for repairs. Everything went wrong in a matter of seconds. Marcus was positioned between the crane and the truck, ready to guide the massive metal component into place. The crane operator, Private Johnson, was relatively new to the job, but had been cleared for this type of operation. As the component swung slowly through the air, suspended by thick steel cables, Marcus raised his right arm to signal the proper positioning. The cable snapped without warning. The sound was like a gunshot echoing through the warehouse. 800 pounds of twisted metal came crashing down, and Marcus had less than a heartbeat to react. His training kicked in, and he tried to dive away from the falling component, but he wasn't quite fast enough. The metal struck his right arm with the force of a sledgehammer, pinning it against the concrete floor. The pain was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced, a white-hot explosion that seemed to consume his entire world. He heard someone screaming and realized it was his own voice. "Get it off him! Get it off him now!" Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos as soldiers rushed to help. It took 6 men and a hydraulic jack to lift the component enough to pull Marcus free. By then, his right arm hung at an impossible angle, clearly shattered in multiple places. The helicopter ride to the military hospital was a blur of pain medication and worried faces. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, but one thought kept returning. His dreams of joining Special Forces required perfect physical condition. As the medical team worked frantically around him, he caught fragments of their conversation. "Multiple compound fractures, significant nerve damage, may never regain full function." Those words hit harder than the falling metal had. Marcus had built his entire identity around his physical strength and military prowess. The idea that he might be medically discharged, might never serve in combat, was more terrifying than the pain coursing through his body. Dr. Sarah Chen was the orthopedic surgeon who met Marcus in the emergency room. She had kind eyes but a direct way of speaking that left no room for false hope. After reviewing the X-rays and CT scans, she sat down beside his hospital bed with the expression that told Marcus everything he needed to know. "The damage is extensive," she said quietly. "We've managed to save your arm, but you're looking at multiple surgeries, months of rehabilitation, and even then," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Marcus, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your arm may never function normally again. The nerve damage alone could result in permanent weakness and limited mobility." Marcus stared at the ceiling tiles, each one a perfect white square that seemed to mock his suddenly imperfect life. His right arm was encased in a complex web of pins, screws, and external fixators that looked more like torture devices than medical equipment. He had always been right-handed. Everything he did, writing, eating, shooting, fighting, depended on that arm. "What about my military career?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Chen's silence was answer enough. The Army had strict physical standards, and a soldier who couldn't perform basic functions with his dominant arm was a liability in combat situations. Medical discharge was almost certainly inevitable. Over the next few weeks, as Marcus lay in his hospital bed watching his fellow soldiers visit and then return to their duties, he felt something he had never experienced before: complete helplessness. The painkillers helped with the physical agony, but nothing could touch the emotional devastation of watching his future crumble. His parents flew in from Ohio, their faces etched with worry and poorly concealed pity. His girlfriend, Sarah, tried to stay positive, but Marcus could see the doubt in her eyes every time she looked at his mangled arm. Even his closest friends from the unit seemed uncomfortable around him, as if his injury might be contagious. "You'll figure something out, man," his buddy Mike said during one visit. "Maybe you can get a desk job or something. The Army needs people in administration, too." A desk job. The words felt like another blow to an already broken body. Marcus had never wanted to push papers or manage supply chains. He wanted to serve on the front lines, to test himself against the most challenging missions the military could offer. Now he was facing the possibility of a medical discharge and a civilian life he had never planned for. The worst part was the nights. When the hospital grew quiet and the nurses made their rounds less frequently, Marcus lay awake staring at his ruined arm and wondering what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. The dreams that had driven him for years, special forces training, overseas deployments, a career built on strength and courage, seemed as shattered as the bones in his right arm. But somewhere in those dark hours, as Marcus wrestled with despair and self-pity, a different kind of strength began to emerge. It wasn't the physical power he had always relied on. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be crushed by falling metal or measured by how much weight he could lift. It was the stubborn refusal to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. Marcus didn't know it yet, but that emerging strength would prove more powerful than any muscle he had ever built. The real test wasn't surviving the accident, it was what he would choose to do next. 6 months after the accident, Marcus Thompson sat in the physical therapy clinic, sweat dripping from his forehead as he struggled to pick up a tennis ball with his right hand. What had once been simple was now nearly impossible. His fingers trembled with the effort, and the ball slipped from his weak grip for the 4th time in a row. "Don't get frustrated," said Linda Martinez, his physical therapist. "You've made incredible progress. 6 months ago, doctors weren't sure you'd ever move those fingers again." Marcus wanted to throw the tennis ball across the room. Progress? He could barely hold a pencil, let alone perform the physical tasks that military life demanded. The Army had granted him extended medical leave, but everyone knew it was just a formality. Medical discharge papers were already being prepared. The rehabilitation process had been brutal. 3 major surgeries had rebuilt his shattered bones with titanium plates and screws. But the nerve damage was the real enemy. His right arm hung limp most of the time, and when he did manage to move it, the motion was clumsy and uncontrolled. Simple tasks like buttoning his shirt or tying his shoes had become monumental challenges. "I want to try something different today," Linda announced, pulling out a resistance band. "We're going to work on building strength in your left arm." "Why?" Marcus asked. "I need my right arm to work." Linda sat down across from him, her expression serious. "Marcus, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen soldiers come back from injuries that should have ended their careers. The ones who succeed aren't the ones who get their old strength back. They're the ones who learn to be strong in new ways." Those words stuck with Marcus as he returned to his small apartment off base. His girlfriend, Sarah, had moved out 2 months earlier. She claimed it wasn't about his injury, but Marcus knew better. She had fallen in love with a strong, confident soldier, not a broken man who struggled to open a jar of peanut butter. That night, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of focusing on what he had lost, he would discover what he could gain. If his right arm was unreliable, he would make his left arm stronger than his right had ever been. If traditional military roles were no longer possible, he would find new ways to serve. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Marcus began spending hours each day in the base gym, not trying to lift heavy weights like before, but learning to perform every exercise with his left hand. He practiced writing left-handed until his penmanship was legible. He learned to shoot left-handed, though his accuracy was embarrassingly poor at first. Sergeant Rodriguez found him in the gym one evening, struggling through a series of one-armed push-ups. "Thompson, what are you doing here?" the sergeant asked. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Marcus paused, sweat dripping onto the gym mat. "I'm not giving up, Sergeant. I know they're going to discharge me, but I'm not going out weak." Something in Marcus's voice must have impressed the sergeant, because Rodriguez didn't order him to leave. Instead, he grabbed a chair and sat down to watch. "You know," Rodriguez said after a few minutes, "the Special Forces don't just test physical strength. They test mental toughness, adaptability, problem-solving under pressure. Maybe you should think about what skills you're really developing here." Those words planted a seed that grew into an obsession. Marcus began researching stories of military personnel who had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. He read about soldiers who had lost limbs and returned to active duty, about pilots who had retrained after injuries, about warriors throughout history who had turned their limitations into advantages. One story particularly captured his attention. A Navy SEAL who had lost his right leg in an explosion, but had returned to complete underwater demolition missions using specialized equipment and techniques. The SEAL had written about the mental shift required to succeed with a disability, the need to think creatively, to find solutions that able-bodied people would never consider. Marcus began applying this philosophy to everything he did. When traditional rifle grips didn't work with his limited right-hand function, he developed his own modified technique. When standard equipment proved too difficult to operate, he found ways to adapt it or use it differently. The breakthrough came during an unofficial training session that Marcus had organized with some of his unit members. They were practicing urban combat scenarios, and Marcus had convinced them to let him participate despite his medical status. As they moved through a mock building, clearing rooms and responding to simulated threats, Marcus found himself thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. His physical limitations had forced him to become a better tactician. While his teammates relied on speed and strength, Marcus had learned to rely on planning and precision. He couldn't kick down doors anymore, but he could predict where enemies might be hiding. He couldn't carry heavy equipment, but he could devise strategies that required less equipment. "Thompson," called out Lieutenant Williams after the exercise, "can I speak with you?" Marcus expected a reprimand for participating in training while on medical leave. Instead, the lieutenant had a proposal. "I've been watching your progress," Williams said. "Your physical condition may have changed, but your military mind has actually gotten sharper. Have you considered applying for a training instructor position? We need people who can teach soldiers to think tactically, not just react physically." The idea had never occurred to Marcus. He had been so focused on returning to his previous role that he hadn't considered how his experiences might qualify him for something different, something potentially even more valuable. Over the next several weeks, Marcus threw himself into studying military strategy, small unit tactics, and training methodology. He discovered that his accident had given him unique insights into problem-solving under adverse conditions. He knew firsthand how to overcome physical limitations, how to maintain mental focus during crisis situations, and how to adapt when conventional approaches failed. Dr. Chen noticed the change during one of his regular medical appointments. "Your attitude has completely shifted," she observed. 6 months ago, you were devastated about the limitations in your right arm. Now you seem energized. Marcus flexed his left hand, which had grown noticeably stronger over the past few months. "I realized I was focusing on the wrong thing. I was trying to get back what I lost instead of building something new." "That's exactly the mindset that leads to successful rehabilitation," Dr. Chen said. "Not just physical recovery, but psychological adaptation. You're becoming a different kind of soldier than you were before the accident." She was right. Marcus was no longer the soldier who relied primarily on physical strength and straightforward approaches. He had become someone who understood that true strength comes from the ability to adapt, to find solutions when obvious paths are blocked, and to turn obstacles into opportunities. The real test of this new philosophy was approaching faster than Marcus realized. In just 2 months, his unit would be participating in the annual Combat Readiness Evaluation, a series of challenging exercises designed to test every aspect of military preparedness. Marcus had been told he would observe rather than participate, but he had other plans. He spent every available hour preparing, not for the physical challenges he had once dominated, but for the mental and strategic challenges that would test his new approach to military service. He studied the evaluation scenarios, developed contingency plans, and practiced modified techniques that worked with his current capabilities. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the combat readiness evaluation would become the stage for the most important performance of his military career. It would be his chance to prove that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most devastating injuries can forge the most powerful soldiers. The morning of the combat readiness evaluation arrived with a crisp autumn chill that made Marcus's damaged arm ache. He stood with his unit at 0500 hours, watching as other soldiers checked their equipment and ran through mental preparations for the day ahead. 8 months had passed since the accident, and this was supposed to be his last week before medical discharge. Colonel Janet Harrison, the base commander, addressed the assembled troops. "Today's evaluation will test your ability to perform under pressure, solve complex problems, and work as a team under adverse conditions. You'll face urban combat scenarios, equipment failures, and time-sensitive missions that require both physical and mental excellence." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He had convinced Lieutenant Williams to let him participate as an observer, but his real plan was much more ambitious. He intended to prove that he belonged in the Army, medical limitations and all. The first scenario took place in a mock urban environment built to simulate Middle Eastern city streets. Teams of 4 soldiers were given a mission: locate and secure a high-value target while avoiding civilian casualties and dealing with equipment malfunctions that would be introduced randomly throughout the exercise. Marcus watched as the first few teams moved through the scenario. They relied heavily on standard procedures, breaching doors with force, advancing in predictable patterns, and using overwhelming firepower to control situations. Most teams completed the mission successfully, but their approaches were textbook solutions that any competent soldier could execute. When his unit's turn came, Sergeant Rodriguez surprised everyone by announcing a change to the team composition. "Thompson will be taking Johnson's position," he declared. Several soldiers exchanged glances, clearly questioning the wisdom of including someone with a damaged arm in a combat evaluation. Private Johnson, who had been the crane operator during Marcus's accident, stepped forward. "Sergeant, with respect, shouldn't someone with full physical capability take point on this?" Rodriguez fixed Johnson with a steady stare. "Thompson has been training harder than anyone in this unit for the past 4 months. If you're questioning my judgment, we can discuss it after the evaluation." As the team moved into the urban environment, Marcus felt the weight of everyone's expectations. His teammates were skilled soldiers, but they were also worried about how his limitations might affect their performance. He knew he had to prove himself within the first few minutes, or they would start making decisions without consulting him. The mission began with their team receiving intelligence about the target's location, a third-floor apartment in a building with multiple entry points. Standard procedure called for splitting into two groups, with one team securing the ground floor while another advanced from above. "Wait," Marcus said as they approached the building. "Look at the window patterns. Third floor, second window from the left. See how the curtain is positioned differently from the others?" Sergeant Rodriguez followed his gaze. "What are you thinking?" "The target knows we're coming," Marcus explained. "That window position is a signal to lookouts. If we use standard breach procedures, we'll walk into an ambush." Marcus had spent hours studying the evaluation scenarios, not just memorizing procedures, but understanding the psychological aspects of the simulations. He had noticed that the exercise controllers often included subtle details that most teams missed in their rush to complete objectives. Instead of the conventional approach, Marcus proposed using the building's fire escape to access the second floor, then creating a diversion that would draw the target's attention away from the main stairwell. It was a more complex plan that required precise timing, but it addressed the tactical reality of the situation rather than just following standard procedures. "Thompson takes point on strategy," Rodriguez decided. "Martinez and Williams, you handle the physical breach. Johnson, you're with me on Overwatch." As they moved through the scenario, Marcus's tactical insights proved invaluable. When their radio equipment malfunctioned, a common twist in the evaluations, he had already prepared hand signals that kept the team coordinated. When they encountered a locked door that required breaching, Marcus identified a ventilation shaft that provided access without alerting the entire building. The most critical moment came when they reached the target's location. Standard procedure called for a quick, aggressive entry to prevent escape or resistance. But Marcus had noticed something the other teams had missed. The scenario included civilian mannequins positioned throughout the apartment. Points would be deducted for any civilian casualties, and the positioning suggested that a conventional breach would inevitably result in unacceptable collateral damage. "We need to get the target to come to us," Marcus whispered to Rodriguez. "Look at the layout. If we breach that door, we'll have no choice but to fire in a direction that includes civilians." Using a technique he had developed during his months of adaptive training, Marcus created a tactical diversion using smoke grenades and careful positioning that forced the target to move toward a window, directly into their line of fire with no civilians at risk. The mission was completed in record time with 0 civilian casualties and perfect target acquisition. As the team exited the scenario, Marcus could see the surprise on the faces of the evaluation officers. Colonel Harrison was reviewing their performance metrics with an expression that suggested she was seeing something unexpected. But the real test came during the final exercise of the day, an individual challenge that required each soldier to navigate a complex obstacle course while solving tactical problems under severe time pressure. This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for since the day of his accident. The course began with a rope climb that seemed impossible for someone with limited function in his right arm. While other soldiers powered up using both hands, Marcus had developed a technique that relied on his much stronger left arm and precise leg positioning. He moved more slowly than his peers, but he moved steadily. The next obstacle required disabling a simulated explosive device, a task that traditionally demanded fine motor control in both hands. Marcus had practiced this scenario hundreds of times using modified techniques. While other soldiers worked with standard tools, Marcus used a combination of tools and techniques that accommodated his limitations while still achieving the objective. The most challenging part came at the end. a simulated combat situation where soldiers had to engage multiple targets while moving through a confined space. This required rapid target acquisition, accurate shooting, and quick reloading, all skills that seemed to favor soldiers with full use of both arms. Marcus approached this challenge differently than anyone had before. Instead of relying on speed and firepower, he used positioning and timing. He identified target priorities based on threat assessment rather than order of appearance. He used cover more effectively than soldiers who relied on quick movement. And when it came time to reload, his modified technique proved faster than the standard procedure. When the exercise ended, Marcus had not just completed every challenge, he had achieved the highest overall score of any soldier that day. Colonel Harrison approached him as he finished cleaning his equipment. "Thompson, I need to speak with you privately." Marcus followed her to a quiet area away from the other soldiers. He expected to be reprimanded for exceeding his medical limitations or for participating without proper authorization. Instead, Colonel Harrison smiled. "I've been reviewing your performance today, and I have to say, it's the most impressive individual display I've seen in 15 years of conducting these evaluations. You didn't just adapt to your limitations, you turned them into tactical advantages." She paused, checking her notes. "Your target acquisition time was 20% faster than average because you took time to assess threats rather than just react to movement. Your equipment handling was more efficient because you had to develop streamlined procedures. And your tactical decision-making was superior because you had to think 3 steps ahead instead of relying on physical dominance." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident: complete confidence in his abilities as a soldier. "There's something else," Colonel Harrison continued. "We've been developing a new training program focused on adaptive tactics and unconventional problem-solving. We need an instructor who understands how to perform under physical limitations and can teach other soldiers to think creatively under pressure. Would you be interested in staying in the Army in a different capacity?" The offer was everything Marcus had hoped for but never dared to request. Not only would he remain in the military, but he would be pioneering a new approach to soldier training, one based on the insights he had gained from his own struggles and adaptations. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in front of his first class of Special Forces candidates. His right arm still bore the scars of the accident, and his grip strength would never fully return. But he had discovered something more valuable than physical perfection: the ability to transform obstacles into opportunities. "Today we're going to learn about adaptive tactics," he told the assembled soldiers. "I'm going to teach you how to be stronger with limitations than you ever were without them." As he watched the eager faces of soldiers who still had full use of all their limbs, Marcus smiled. They would learn what he had learned: that true strength isn't about the absence of weakness, but about the presence of will. Sometimes it takes a crushing blow to reveal the unbreakable core within. The soldier who had been defined by his physical strength had become something far more powerful: a warrior whose greatest weapon was his mind, and whose greatest victory was proving that limitations are often just launching points for new possibilities.